Silverstein with the Southern Appalachian Highlands Conservancy, and we want to thank you for joining this webinar on pollination. What is it? Why is it important? How can we increase opportunities for more pollinators by creating pollinator-friendly habitat? And we're grateful for everybody wanting to learn more about this topic. We welcome and thank Tamarya Sims, SHC Community Farm Associate and Certified Environmental Educator for North Carolina, and Amy Boyd, Professor of Biology at Warren Wilson College. Tamarya joined SHC in 2020. They're a teacher, photographer, gardener, farmer, herbalist, beekeeper, chicken wrangler, and tractor driver, who's passionate about food justice and making farm and garden educational accessible to all people. And Amy is a professor of botany, ecology, and evolutionary biology at Warren Wilson College, scientist by training, educator by profession, artist by nature. Amy lives in Swannanoa, and we want to thank you both for making this presentation today. So we'll go ahead and get started.
Thank you so much, Carl. So yes, we're going to get started today. We are talking about backyard conservation with an emphasis on pollinators today. My name is Tamarya. As Carl said, I'm the Community Farm Associate, and I'm joined here today with Dr. Amy Boyd. And we are so glad to have you out today, out here virtually. So for today, we're going to have an agenda of talking about what is pollination, who are our pollinators, pollinators in the ecosystem, pollinators for humans, conservation, and how you can help with some conservation in your backyard. So this is a photo of me. My name is Tamarya. I am from Conover, North Carolina, which is about an hour east of Asheville. It's the ancestral land of the Catawba Indian Nation. I came to Asheville to go to UNCA, where I obtained a degree in environmental studies and a concentration in ecology and field biology. I am also a certified environmental educator for North Carolina, and I own and farm for myself on the side under a farm that I call Soulful Simone Farm. And I grow cut flowers and medicinal herbs. And I love to talk about the pollinators that love the flowers and the herbs. And I'll let Amy introduce herself.
Yeah, I'm Amy Boyd. This is me a few days ago in the Sonoran Desert. I am professor of biology at Warren Wilson College. My research emphasis is pollination biology, but I also study a rare cactus in this desert that you can see here. And I do floristic studies in our area on conservation lands and study plant ecology and evolution in general.
Thank you. I wanted to have a land acknowledgement for us today. We are on the ancestral land of the Cherokee and the Yuchi people. Right now, I am in Asheville, North Carolina, and so this is their ancestral land, and we want to uplift their name and give them gratitude for protecting, stewarding our ecosystems, organisms, and building the fertile soil we are on today. And this has happened in the past, in the present, and in the future. So I just wanted to hold some time for that. So let's get started, y'all. What is pollination? Pollination is the process that happens in order for plants to reproduce and create seeds and or fruit. So the photo I have on the right talks about some of the anatomy. And you can see that there is a pollinator that is obtaining pollen grains from the anther, which is the male organ. We don't have that terminology here, but I have it on the next slide. and it will go and land near a stigma, which is the female organ, and the pollen will go into that ovary. So we can see that happening in the photo. This allows the plant to reproduce or to fertilize and make seeds. And so this photo here has more of that terminology. So we hear this terminology going back and forth sometimes. So when we talk about the stamen, it is the male parts of the plant, and that encompasses the anther and the filament, which we see in this photo. And then to the right, we can see the carpel, which is the female parts of the plant, and that includes the stigma style and the ovary. And in the ovary, we also see that there's an ovule. So this is some of the terminology and anatomy of the flowers, and we can usually see some of these things on flowers like lilies. We can definitely see the anther and filament and the stigma. And so, yeah, so some of the other terminology you see on this is the petal, the sepal, the receptacle, which supports and connects the flower to the stem. So when we talk about pollination, there are two types that we hear a lot about, which is cross-pollination and self-pollination. So cross-pollination is pollen that is from a different flower of the same species. So in this picture, you can see that these two flowers, it's not, an actual, picture of a flower, it's a drawing, but we can just say that these are the same species of flower. And so this pollinator taking pollen from the left flower and pollinating the right flower would be cross-pollination. And then self-pollination is pollen from the same flower is fertilizing that flower. So it would just be this one plant at the bottom here that says self-pollination. And so some cross-pollinating plants that you may have heard of consist of zinnias, snapdragons, violas, potato, tomatoes, and rice. And some self-pollinating plants are lilies, roses, oats, corn, cabbage, carrots, coffee, and apples. But I do want to note that all of these have a much better reproductive success with cross-pollination. So they're definitely able to self-pollinate, but when cross-pollination is involved, they have more success. So that is some of the pollination we see happening on plants and in the environment that we're in. And I just also want to name that I can't see the chat. So if there's anything popping up in the chat, Carl or Amy, feel free to let me know. So who are our pollinators? So pollination includes abiotic, you can say pollinators, and biotic pollinators. So abiotic means that it is not living. So that consists of water and wind. And so we can see on this picture to the right what wind pollination can look like, or abiotic pollination by wind. So wind hits a staminate flower on this hazel tree, which is the male organs, and it releases this cloud of pollen that will hopefully go and fertilize the carpelate, which is the female part, the carpelate flower. So we can see that happening on this hazel tree to the right, and some other examples of plants that use abiotic pollination are grasses, coniferous trees, some deciduous trees, and some aquatic plant species. So this is what we call abiotic pollination. Then we have biotic pollination, which includes living things, living organisms. And so those can look like bees, wasps, ants, butterflies, moths, flies, thrips, beetles, birds, and bats. So it is not just reduced to bees. There's a lot of different types of pollinators out there. We can see on the right, there is a pollinator on a flower. And I love a good unsolicited photo or plant ID and insect ID. So can we take some time to go into the chat and identify what this flower is? Does anyone know what this flower is? So let's just take some time to show up in the chat because I want this to be interactive. So I see 2, Turk's cap lily, a 3, a 4. Yeah, so yeah, this is a Turk's cap lily variety, and they are very, very beautiful flowers. Can we take some time to identify the insect that's on the flower, possibly? I see a swallowtail butterfly, a swallowtail. Great. Yeah. So I actually identified this as a swallowtail, but I do not know my butterflies like that. So thank you for letting me know. So yeah, these are some of our pollinators and some of the beautiful flowers that we see in the environment because of them. And I wanted to talk about some of the cool things that flowers and other plants have evolved to have. So this is the picture of a flower, and it is showing the fact that there is ways that bees, mostly bees who can't see red like humans can, they use ultraviolet patterns to see this flower. And so a lot of flowers have these patterns to attract bees. It's like a bullseye, and it will show them where they can come down and get some nectar or pollen. And I tried really hard not to say what this flower is because I want y'all to identify it as well. It's really hard for me not to say it, but can people come in the chat and talk and say what this flower is? Ooh, is this a hard one? Oh, oh. Yeah, so Rudbeckia, black-eyed Susan, one of my favorite plants I love to plant and use as a cut flower. So yes, this is Rudbeckia, or also known as black-eyed Susan. And it uses these ultraviolet patterns to coerce the bees to come and basically pollinate it, but they get a snack in return. So pollinators in our ecosystem, I'm going to call in my friend, Professor Boyd, to come and speak on this. So thank you so much for being here, and here you go.
Right. So yeah, pollinators, I'm really intrigued by interactions between living organisms in ecosystems. I get very excited about the complexity of ecosystems and how different organisms influence one another. And so there's a number of ways in which pollinators show up in our ecosystems and the roles that they play. The most obvious is their pollination services. We recognize pollinators as important to plant reproduction, which we've already talked about today. In doing so, not only do they help plants create seeds and fruits, but they also increase genetic diversity. So Tamarya mentioned a number of plants that can self-pollinate if they need to, but pollinators allow them to move genes and intermix their genes between individuals. And that increases the genetic diversity in plant populations, which makes them more resilient in many cases. So that can be really important. Pollination services also is important, not just for the plant, but for all kinds of animals that live in those ecosystems as well, because that allows those plants to provide certain kinds of food for herbivores, such as fruits, nuts, seeds that many herbivores may depend on, including us. Third, next we would talk about pollinators as an actual food source themselves. Bees, wasps, moths, all of these kinds of pollinators that are in our ecosystems playing that role are also food for larger animals. And that can be really, really fundamental to the food web in those systems. So we don't want to forget that piece. And then lastly, I'll just mention that when honeybees are present in the ecosystem, they also create honey as a food source for a number of different kinds of organisms. So that's an additional way they can play a role in the ecosystem.
Great, thank you so much. And also honey can be used for medical reasons as well, which is something I love to talk about. So we can get into that another time though. Got to keep you guys wondering. So pollinators for humans. I love talking about this because it has to do with food. Pollinators and humans mainly overlap with the food system. Of course, pollination of other plants and trees definitely help create oxygen for us and to breathe and live. But for someone who's really passionate about food justice, that's why I really love talking about and making this correlation to pollinators. So with 7 agricultural crops worth 7 agricultural crops worth $1.25 billion annually in the US are pollinated primarily by wild insects. So those 7 crops are cashews, squash, mangoes, cardamom, cacao/chocolate, cranberries, and high bush blueberries. So I wanted to come in the chat and ask, when's the last time you had one of these crops? How recent was it? And what was it? Which one was it? Blueberries today, cashews yesterday. Eating squash as we speak. Cashews yesterday. Cardamom on the squash. Blueberries in the smoothie this morning. Had chocolate today and blueberries yesterday. So we see how these things show up in our life. I think about like 3 days ago, I had some chocolate. So we can all thank our wild insects for these as well. So at least 100, thank you so much. And at least 150 major crops rely on wild pollinators. And 800 cultivated plant species, for example, grains, vegetables, and fruits rely on wild bees and other insects. And I did want to mention that globally, bee pollination is the most valuable ecosystem service provided by wildlife. So, you know, bees get a really big part in our pollination when we talk about pollination, and they're a big deal. But we do have some other insects that are great pollinators. And some of the references I got from these slides today are coming from this book. It is called The Forgotten Pollinators, and it was recommended to me by Dr. Boyd. It is such a great book and has so much about the forgotten pollinators, the things that aren't bees, the insects that are bees, all the other things we use. So I wanted to give some percentages of pollinators, different types of pollinators that pollinate some of our cultivars that we use in our everyday life. So 73% of cultivars are pollinated by bees, which is a large percent, obviously. 19% use flies to move pollination. So we should think about that more often when we're outside and we're worried about flies. We should promote more flies around us because they do move pollen to different plants. 6.5% use bats. I love bats, and talking about bats, there's some things called bat boxes that you can create to have more bats around. And they also eat a lot of mosquitoes, which is one reason why I love bats. 5% use wasps, another 5% for beetles, 4% for birds, and another 4% for butterflies and moths. So our pollinators are very diverse, but yes, bees do create a lot of pollination for the cultivars that we eat. Pollinator conservation. So some of the conservation we see for pollinators these days is protecting monarch butterflies. So if you don't know, the monarchs have a great migration from North America, the northern part of North America, all the way down to southern parts like Mexico. And with that research, a lot of citizen science and community science is needed to track the butterflies. So if that is something you're interested in, you can find there's a simulation of the migration on the monarchjointventure.org. And it has a lot of great resources and ways that you can also contribute to the research that scientists use for these monarchs. And the really cool thing I love about them is that, like, when they start their journey, it's their grandchildren that actually end up getting to the end, to Mexico. So that's really cool. And yeah, a great way to contribute to it. So we also have the other things that happen when protecting monarchs is having to do with their habitat. So in this picture to the right is a monarch, and I'm just going to go ahead and let you know that it is on a milkweed plant. And yeah, milkweed is the one type of plant that a lot of people will plant for these monarchs so that they can have a food source and habitat. And so that is something you see a lot whenever we talk about protecting monarchs. So that is some conservation around them, and we protect them because they pollinate a lot of wild flowers and wild plants that we see in our environments. And then we also have protecting bees. So I love to talk about bees because I also am a beekeeper, and actually during the pandemic, there were a lot of folks who started beekeeping. So we had so many more beekeepers happening around the time that the pandemic happened. And many people don't know that honeybees are actually not native to our environment, even though they do pollinate a lot of our plants and a lot of our cultivars. But for me, I had this pact with myself that if I'm going to have honeybees and be a beekeeper, I'm going to make sure that I plant pollinator gardens. So that is something I love to tell people when they think of pollinator conservation, because many people think that means becoming a beekeeper and having more bees. But it's really important, if you become a beekeeper, that you really get into treating for mites and other things like that, because those mites that happen in a beehive affect other populations of bees and other native insects and bees. So that's something that is really important if you want to become a beekeeper. But I would also like to say bee hotels are really awesome when it comes to protecting bees. So when I was at UNCA, they installed a bee hotel, and it's like this large, tiny house for some bees. And a lot of our native bees like to have burrow in holes and things like that. So bee hotels are a great way to have some pollinator conservation around your community. I will say that in the past, I've seen the Girl Scouts love creating bee hotels. So if that's anything, if you know Girl Scouts, they will probably want to come and get a badge by having a bee hotel or creating one. But I do recommend creating them with as many natural things that you can get. I've seen them created with like plastic bottles and things. And when storms happen, those go flying everywhere. And so we want to make sure that we are keeping our environment clean.
Maria, can I chime in with a couple of things?
Yeah, of course.
Two things I would say to add to what you're saying, because this is all great stuff.
Mhm.
One is that if you're going to plant milkweed, you need to plant native varieties of milkweed, because it's a lot of people plant tropical milkweeds, which do attract monarchs, but are not as good for them. So they'll switch over to the tropical ones, but then they don't do as well. So stick with the native species. And for the bee hotels, do your research, because there's a lot of bee hotels created out there that are actually not that great for bees for a number of reasons. So just be careful about that.
Yes, thank you so much. I did not know about the tropical milkweed. So yeah, that's really important. And I'm going to have some resources for you whenever you're planting things. We have a lot of places that give us native seeds and native plants. So yes, please do your research. This is just a start and a door to open up to this whole world where you can participate, but you have to be very intentional about what you do. So thank you so much, Dr. Boyd. And then a couple of other ways we see pollinator conservation around us is with pollinator gardens. That's a big thing that we see around our communities, on our schools, campuses, and everywhere. But I really am gung-ho about the pollinator gardens, and I'll have a resource in the end to show you where you can find different flowers and what flowers to use and what they're good for, and the native ones. So that will come in a second. And then also just reducing pesticide use or not using them at all is another conservation tactic we see. As many people know, with bees and almonds and things like that, and we see a lot of pesticides in our industrial ag world. We have to save our pollinators because they're the reason why we're alive and we have food. So that's another way we see pollinator conservation. And then when it comes to farming, I work on the community farm. I am a gardener and a farmer. I do want to hold space for the fact that there are indigenous agricultural systems that we take from today that do promote these types of conservation and farming. So that looks like using diverse farming practices to enhance pollination and pollinators. And I read about this specifically with the Karen people in Thailand. They use, rotational cropping and fallows and things to promote having more environment and giving the land a rest, and really being a productive system for pollinators to not just be a source for humans, but also just giving them a great environment. And so today we may hear things like regenerative agriculture that usually takes things from indigenous agricultural systems. And yes, there's ways that this regenerative agriculture really just looks at the whole ecosystem and the ecology of it. And it's not just farming, but it's feeding the whole land and thinking about how it all comes together. So those are some things that you can look for if you're farming or gardening, and they have some great resources for ways that you can promote protecting our pollinators and enhancing environments for them. So how can you help? You came to the right place, because I love giving advice. How can you help? So pollinators and backyard conservation. So in our backyard, we can plant diverse flowers that bloom at different times of the season, or different times and different seasons. So that's really important because of, phenology comes into that. we have early, like things that are early to open and late to open. And so we really want to give a wide variety of food to pollinators and different nectar and pollen sources to keep them coming around. We can also think about our lawns. So if you let your flowers in your lawn bloom before you mow, that also gives the pollinators a source of pollen and nectar. And then also mowing your lawn less. So that looks like every 3 weeks. And if this is something that is an issue, like having HOA, then like I definitely would promote having those things changed in order to really promote pollinator conservation in your community, because it's really important. Like Professor Boyd said, planting native milkweed, not tropical milkweed. So doing some more research around that. And if you're into seed saving, having a library where you can provide native seeds that you have saved yourself, because that goes a long way. And it's already, the seeds that you harvest from your environment are already keen on what's going on in this area and aren't coming from other places. So that's a really big thing you can do. When you do have, flowers and gardens, providing a water source for the pollinators to have is a big deal, because they travel long ways and they need water to really keep them going and keep them healthy. And then like we were talking about with bees, bees like abandoned rodent nests and unkept vegetation areas. So if you have some places like that around your backyard or on your land, and even though it's not, beautiful to the eye, it is helping create an environment for our bees to pollinate our plants. So even though it's not pretty, it's helping our environment. So some pollinators use hollow plant stems to nest. So if you do have some plants that grow, not cutting them back as soon as they die, letting them go into, spring or whatever other season, so that there's time for pollinators to use them as a house, which is really awesome. And then the bee hotels and colony boxes are another way you can participate in having some backyard conservation, but also doing your research and making sure that what you're creating is best for the organisms you have around you. And so, a lot of people I talk to really want something out of their backyard. They want to eat from it. And so there are ways you can create edible native landscapes using permaculture practices that are a great way to support our pollinators. And also incorporating no-till gardening. So that looks like having more perennials around. There's many native perennial edible plants that support pollinators. And then there's just also so many perennial flowers and other things that can just be a garden bed or a flower bed just for your pollinators. So that's another thing you can do for when you're gardening or doing some landscaping around your house. You can also just please avoid pesticide use, or do heavy research, or ask your local North Carolina extension agent. If you really have to use pesticides, they'll have some great advice for you when it comes to pesticide use. I am definitely not an expert on pesticide use at all. I try not to do that. There's some other things you can do, like companion planting. So planting plants with your food or things like that, that bring in pollinators, and plants that keep away the pests that will eat up your food and things like that. So I definitely recommend companion planting instead of pesticide use if you can. And supporting organizations that practice pollinator conservation work. So in Asheville, we have a organization called Asheville Greenworks, which has a Bee City USA Asheville program. And so if you go to their website and look at their Bee City USA Asheville program, they have a lot of resources for you to create pollinator gardens in your backyard. And they have a list of native plants and other perennials and things. They usually have a tree sale. And so they're a great resource that we have in our area. And that also looks like, our organization, which is a land trust that protects a lot of land that is just for organisms and the environment to just exist. And even though you may never see them, they're still happening as we speak. So supporting organizations like us and other land trusts are also doing some pollination conservation work. And then I wanted to give you some resources like the North Carolina Extension Gardener Plant Toolbox. I really recommend this toolbox. If I ever think about putting anything in the ground, I'm going to go to this toolbox. They have so many categories for edible. It could be a category about edibles, natives. It can be categories about if it's a shady spot, a sunny spot, what zone you're in, what things you're trying to attract. They have so many things on there that can help you with planting a native perennial garden or just a native garden in general for pollinators. So I recommend going to that toolbox if you are planning on planting for pollinators. And then lastly, I recommend the book, The Forgotten Pollinators by Stephen Buckman and Gary Paul Nabhan. The last chapter is called Cultivating Lasting Relationships, Pollinator Gardens and Ecological Restoration. And so I really recommend that book, but that last chapter has a lot of great resources for you to take away. And after you're done reading the book, to just go back in your backyard and create an amazing habitat for pollinators. So yeah, I just really want to hold the space for native pollinators because we do talk about honeybees a lot, but many other bees like bumblebees, mason, sweat bees, miner bees, carpenter bees, orchid bees, they are more effective at actually pollinating fruit and vegetables than honeybees. And so if we start creating an environment like that brings those bees in, it means a lot for the food system. And so that also means a lot to me. And then another fact was that bumblebees are 40 to 60 more times likely at being effective at pollinating tomatoes than honeybees. And so they actually yield larger fruits. And all the gardeners I know love tomatoes. So I thought that was a really cool fact. Every time I'm trying to garden, people are like, are you growing tomatoes? And I'm like, oh my gosh. So yeah, I thought that was a really cool fact about tomatoes. And if you establish a garden around your edible garden to have pollinators come in, you may see a change in how your foods grow. So I wanted to say thank you for coming to this presentation, and also thank you to Dr. Amy Boyd for collaborating with me on this. We're also going to have a chance for questions after this, but I wanted to leave you with this quote that says, there is a Korean saying that we should walk like the bees. When the bees fly, they fly better together and look after each other in the interest of the whole community of bees. They live in harmony together and increase the biodiversity in the forest with their actions like we do. And so I wanted you guys to take that with you today and, live in harmony with the bees. So thank you. And if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat.
Wow. Thank you, Tamarya and Amy, for that presentation. I feel like I learned so much, and I feel inspired to go make some changes in our yard and improve the habitat. We have had some great questions in the chat, and so everybody who has an additional question, please feel free to type it into the Q&A or the chat, and we'll try to get to your question. But just to take a few in the order they've come, Dawn asked, how do we know when to cut back vegetation and perennials so that it's the best use for pollinators?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that. Because I was just talking with the folks on my campus about this very question. And the answer is that the bees, they use the hollow stems as a nest for their larvae, and they pupate inside of those stems during the winter and then emerge in the spring. Unlike honeybees stay active all year round, but most bees, the native bees, don't. They overwinter as larvae and pupa, and so they need a place to do that. Many of them use hollow stems to do that, so the longer you leave those, ideally mid-spring is a good time to take them down once the bees have emerged. If that's impossible, I would just try to leave them as long as you can into the spring.
Thanks for that. And we have a question of what lawn flowers are being recommended. And not sure if that was like the delay in mowing in order to just let things that are already there come up, or if there's any additional kind of lawn flowers that I guess can be encouraged.
Yeah, I can speak to that one. So many of our lawns, when I'm thinking of my lawn, it has a lot of white clover, some ground ivy, dead nettle, henbit. So a lot of them are actually herbaceous plants and not grasses, and they will flower if you let them. So if these are some plants that are not grasses, so if you let them flower, they can promote pollinators coming out to them. So though I think it depends on your lawn type of what will flower. So yeah, those are the things that I see in my yard.
Thanks, Tamarya. And then we have a question about carpenter bees and if there's things that we can do to discourage people from killing them, since they have, I guess in some places, a negative, destructive reputation.
Dr. Boyd, do you have any?
I am certainly not an expert on discouraging carpenter bees. I don't know a lot about that. I think the first thing to do is educate people on why they're important to our ecosystems and to our food systems. They're really, really important pollinators. And then once they understand why, I think providing them alternative places to nest, such as bee hotels and wood that they can dig into that's not going to be a problem, and then finding ways to keep them out of the wood you don't want them destroying. And that's the part I don't really know a lot about. I know there are ways to block off the wood that you want to protect, but it's hard when it's your whole house. I get that that's an issue. So I am afraid I'm not really the expert on that question.
Yeah, thank you. I was going to say the same thing about providing another habitat, but maybe you can convince them to become a scientist on carpenter bees. And if they're going to kill them, then they're going to have to, start another batch of bees and let them go into the wild. I'm all about convincing people. Usually whenever you dislike something and you do a lot of research on it, you end up loving it. So I definitely recommend giving them as much education as possible.
Well, maybe a start for that is to recommend that folks go to our YouTube site and watch this webinar, which is we're gonna put up on YouTube, so anybody can see it. And again, we want to thank Tamarya and Amy for a wonderful presentation, and thank everybody who's participating in the webinar and watching it. And please tune in for upcoming lunch and learns that we'll host. I think we have one scheduled for April 7th about new public land places that have been acquired and are being opened. So we love sharing more information about these topics and inspiring people. So if there's no more questions in the chat, we want to thank everybody, and especially Tamarya, you and Amy, for really a wonderful presentation. So thank you. And we'll look forward to seeing everybody at a future Lunch and Learn.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.